Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here in person for our Presidential Scholars Research Symposium. It's really wonderful to see so many familiar faces, but also quite a number of new faces here. You'll hear from our two presidential scholars, Drs. Julia Hyland Bruno and Matthew Sachs, who are leaving the program this semester because they have finished their 3 years with us. The scholars will share research updates and conclusions, discuss interdisciplinary collaboration here at Columbia, and reveal the next steps in their careers. I also want to welcome all of our faculty mentors who play a crucial role in the PSSN program by working with our scholars, guiding their research projects, and helping them to navigate the academic landscape. You'll hear from each of the scholars' mentors tonight. But before I introduce the first speaker, I do want to briefly tell you about the PSSN program. Okay. The Presidential Scholars in Society and Neuroscience program, of which I am the chair, it facilitates cross-disciplinary collaborative research to advance our understanding of mind, brain, and behavior. It brings together talented early career scholars from various fields with faculty experts in neuroscience and in the humanities, arts, and social sciences. The core of our program is the community of early career postdoctoral scholars who are pursuing independent research at the intersection of neuroscience and the arts, humanities, and social sciences. Each scholar receives tailored support for their project from at least 2 faculty mentors from different departments who have the relevant knowledge and expertise to guide their research. Current mentors come from neuroscience, sociology, psychology, medical humanities, ethics, music, philosophy, English and comparative literature, and many other disciplines. The scholars and PSSN faculty are central in organizing interdisciplinary events that we've been doing all year. I'm very pleased to announce, thrilled in fact, that we have 2 new presidential scholars who will officially join the program this July. First, Paul Linton, who is a neuroscientist and philosopher specializing in 3D vision, who received his PhD in 2021 from the Center for Applied Vision Research from the City University of London, where his research challenged our understanding of distance perception by showing the visual system is unable to triangulate distance using our eyes. As a presidential scholar, Paul will develop his new 2-stage theory of 3D vision using the latest techniques in machine learning and fMRI in the hope of explaining how we experience the 3D world. Neda Nemati researches the role of lived experience in neuroscientific experimentation and the influence of such experience in characterizing behavioral and cognitive concepts. She received philosophical training at Millsaps College, where she got a BSc. She earned her MSc in biological sciences, and she will defend her PhD in history and philosophy of science from the University of Pittsburgh this month. As a presidential scholar, Neda will draw from historical and phenomenological traditions to characterize an account of lived experience in neuroscience and to develop a philosophy of behavior. By characterizing the role of lived experience in scientific practices, Neda's project aims to impart greater clarity in scientific uses of behavioral concepts and their clinical translation. We're very excited about both of these scholars' research areas. So for all of you, if you'd like to hear about upcoming events and sign up for our monthly newsletter, please do so on our website, and you can also find us on social media, and you can find recordings of all of our previous seminars in person and online on the website, so please check those out. We've had many years of wonderful panels and seminars. So for those of you on Zoom, you can use the Q&A button to submit questions at any time. You can upvote questions, and we'll get to as many questions both in the room and in the Zoom room as we can at the end of each talk. The PSSN program would not be possible without the support of the leadership at Columbia, our valued steering committee members, and faculty from across the university who participate on the advisory committee, mentor our scholars, and volunteer to review and interview applicants. Thanks to all of you who have helped make this program an example of interdisciplinary achievement. We'll be providing all kinds of information about the program on the chat throughout the event. And now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Julia Hyland Bruno. Dr. Bruno is an ethologist interested in behavioral development with a particular focus on social animals, such as songbirds or humans that learn how to communicate with one another. She received her PhD in biopsychology and behavioral neuroscience from the City University of New York, where she studied the rhythmic patterning of zebra finch vocal learning. As a presidential scholar, Dr. Bruno explores how patterns of communication among individuals influence social organization. Please help me welcome Dr. Hyland Bruno.
Thank you so much, Pamela, and thanks everybody for joining. It's a bit bittersweet to be here, but I'm excited to tell you a little bit about my research on zebra finch communication that I've been conducting in the past few years here at Columbia, and also the evolution of my research interests through my interdisciplinary work and experiences here in PSSN. From questioning the status of the zebra finch as a model organism to developing a comparative species research program. My research belongs to a tradition that has roots in biology and psychology of studying animal behavior, and specifically communication systems which are socially acquired through vocal learning from conspecifics. So the most familiar example to us of this kind of communication system is human language. This vocal learning capacity is very rare. It is not shared by our nearest primate relatives, and among mammals, only a few lineages seem to have evolved it. Of course, none of these non-human species have human-like language systems, but also, bats don't speak dolphin. However, according to an operational definition of vocal production learning as the ability to modify one's vocalizations in response to sounds heard, the distantly related groups bolded on these trees have all convergently evolved a similar capacity. Songbirds are the most species-rich group of vocal learners. So the branch up here on the top right represents approximately 4,000 different species. The invention of the spectrograph sound analyzer during World War II enabled the first scientific demonstrations that songbirds learn their songs. And here you're looking at some examples of spectrographic images of bird songs. The spectrograph analyzes a sound into its component frequencies and plots these over time, which you can read left to right, somewhat like a musical score, except that the pitches are not discrete, and also other qualities of the sound are captured. And these very precise acoustic measurements, combined with cross-fostering and tape tutoring experiments, showed that in some species, groups form regional dialects, meaning that song types are not innate, but reflect the songs sung in a young bird's natal environment. Beginning in the 1970s, the brain mechanisms that underlie this remarkable sensory motor transformation that links incoming auditory information to the complex motor patterning of song production began to be characterized, and this research program was so successful that birdsong eventually became a model system for studying the biological mechanisms of speech and language acquisition. Today, one species has become the dominant model organism in this research program, and that's the zebra finch. Many more papers are written about zebra finches than all other songbird species combined, and most of these papers are about zebra finches in captivity in a lab setting. Most of us people like me know very little about how zebra finches live in the wild in Australia and Indonesia. And there are different reasons for why this is, one being that they live and reproduce and sing pretty well in captivity. And the model zebra finch, you should know, is also male. Females have different brains, and they do not sing, they do not learn their songs. Each male zebra finch produces a single unique learned vocal sequence, which we call his song. And I play it for you. I'll also play it for you at half speed in a moment so that you can perhaps get a better sense of what the chorded female hears when she's listening, and maybe pick up some of the subtler acoustic structure that you can see in the sonogram. So you probably noticed the repeating motif structure of the song. Male zebra finches acquire their song motif during a sensitive period for learning by copying their father's song or another adult model, and song imitation can be highly faithful. This is the work of a 2-month-long matching process that coincides with sexual maturation and begins with juvenile babbling at around 30 days after hatching. Much fascinating work has been done over several decades now using mainly individual zebra finches to explore the intricacies and neural mechanisms of this developmental process. However, in the course of the research program's development, some of the phenomena under study have become oversimplified to the point of distortion. So first, many people will say that from a motor learning perspective, zebra finches are so great to study because, unlike some other species, their adult songs are so simple and stereotyped rendition to rendition. And second, a picture has emerged of songbird vocal learning as a capacity whose entire function is to produce accurate imitations. Today, I'm going to show you some ways in which these myths misrepresent, I believe, the animals that they've been built around, whose songs are plastic rather than stereotyped, and whose vocal learning is socially motivated and includes learning how to communicate. In many ways, these observations are not surprising. What's surprising is that they've been ignored. In nature, zebra finches are highly social. Unlike many migratory songbirds, they are not territorial. They live in long-lasting nomadic groups, and this is the context in which they acquire their songs. The focus on song imitation, learning what to sing, ignores the problem of learning how to sing in terms of vocal coordination, which may entail group norms regarding turn-taking and also depend on individual plasticity and adaptation. I joined the PSSN program in order to work with 2 experts on interactivity, Peter Bearman and George Lewis. And one focus of my PSSN research has been characterizing how zebra finches sing in social interactions. So this is a pretty understudied aspect of this organism that has been largely excluded from its status as a model organism for vocal production learning. Because male zebra finches sing to court females, song is often assumed to be primarily a reproductive behavior. However, male zebra finches also sing outside of the courtship setting, including when no females are around, and coordinated co-singing can include both unison and very tight turn-taking. For example, you're looking at a sonogram of 2 males singing together, and I've color-coded their 2 parts underneath in red and blue. The motif for each is the longer bar in the 2 rows, and what you're seeing is the blue bird producing 3 motifs in succession, and then the red bird producing calls while that's happening and overlapping his final motif in perfect unison. I'm going to play this for you at half speed. I think you may be able to hear the 2 voices. Sorry. I think that audio is a bit quieter than the other files, but we'll just move on. Could the audience hear it at all? Yes? Okay, great. And here is an example of rapid turn taking. So the sonogram is two birds again, but here their vocalizations largely don't overlap. It's a father and his adult son who's learned his song from the father, and the son joins in really seamlessly, so it sounds like one performance. And this gap that the son lags is comparable to the silent gaps within his own song. My interest in these co-singing patterns led me to try to understand the longer timescales of zebrafinch song structure. The motif is the largest song unit which can be considered to be stereotyped. However, zebrafinches do not produce isolated motifs when they sing. Song has a higher level structure, which is the song bout. Each song performance begins with a series of accelerating introductory notes, these short sounds that precede the bout, and the number of repetitions of the basic motif is variable. Motifs are linked by characteristic silent intervals as well as innate calls. And song bout structure is not stereotyped. So here's an example of two bouts from a single bird. And in another moment, he has different songs he can sing, even though there are units that you can identify that the two samples share. In order to visualize this kind of structure and its variability, we can take an analog rather than symbolic representation of the song bout by extracting vectors of acoustic features from the sonograms. In this case, you're looking at pitch with the color scale that indicates the song's introductory notes in red. And we can do this with many song bouts. And align the bouts to the onset of the first motif so that with a large enough sample, in this case, there are 400 renditions stacked on top of each other, sorted by type of bout in this plot, we can see that indeed song bouts exhibit structure beyond the stereotype motif. So you can see this clearly if you focus between the 0 and 1 second mark on the x-axis. There are clear vertical columns of color, but if you move beyond that golden strip, which is the last element of the motif, there are branching points in the bird's song. He can either stop or go directly into another motif, or sing an introductory note, or add a different connecting element, which are these elements in orange at the very bottom. And the motif is stereotyped more or less every time it recurs, but because the later motifs in a bout occur at different times, you don't see those vertical columns later in the visualization. So an added layer of complexity that I have found is that these structures are not fixed. Here are 4 snapshots from one individual, and now the bouts are sorted by duration in these plots. And these are representative from periods of time in the bird's life. So around the end of his sensitive period for acquiring the motif at day 84, a bit later in his young adulthood, day 149, and then ongoing, the bout structures continue to change beyond the sensitive period. I'm interested in how this plasticity above the level of the stereotype motif maps onto already well-known context dependency of zebrafinch song that has been more restricted in its scope. So specifically that we already know that female-directed song tends to be slightly faster and shows somewhat reduced acoustic variability and is accompanied by a greater number of introductory notes and is also associated with reduced activity in the brain circuitry devoted to learning and plasticity, interestingly. By the way, although we know that context can matter in this way for the males, this has not been controlled in many studies that use females to induce song in the lab. So sometimes a female will be brought in to get the male to sing, and the male is being recorded maybe with electrodes in his brain. And in published studies without mention, you can actually see record of the female there. So the sonogram is blown up, and I've underlined 3 repeating areas of the male's song that don't look the same because in the first and the third, there's a female calling in the background where there's supposed to be a silent gap. And then again, a different landmark in the song, with a call and without, and another example. So this female is very vocal here. This involvement of the mute sex is something that I've started to look into further, using on-bird microphones to help with source separation. So what you are listening to are the synchronized wing flaps of a mated pair in visual contact with one another. And here is a recording of the male courting the female. Here is the male's part separated out. As you can see in the blue waveform, we can't attribute the full courtship performance to the sounds of the male alone, and here is the female's part. So although she doesn't sing and can't sing, the female is vocalizing at least as much as the male, and she's producing something like a rhythmic accompaniment that matches some structure in the male's song. Overlaid, the zebra finch directed song to his mate is actually a duet. In the future, I'm hoping to study how these tightly synchronized performances emerge. As a first step, I analyzed 4 first dates between 4 different pairs of the same two males and 2 females. And I found that females appear to time their calls to match the structural regularities of the male song, and that both males and females vocalize differently with different partners. So much of my work consists of obtaining stable descriptions of an individual's repertoire in order to understand context-dependent variations. Here's an illustration of how bout repertoires can vary across individuals. Here again, I'm sorting by duration, and the shortest bouts are on the top. You're looking at snapshots of the repertoires of 4 different birds, which we can rank according to how much variability they contain in sequence, and also in timing. Interestingly, these bout structures are not imitated. They're actually, this group shows the mature repertoires of a tutor and 3 of his former pupils. The tutor's bout happens to be the most variable on the upper right. His best pupil, in terms of motif imitation, developed the very different repertoire that you see in the lower right quadrant. And the 2 birds also sound very different from one another, despite having the same, more or less, motif. This is the tutor. And his pupil. More aggressive and stereotyped about performance. Here are the other 2 pupils, more variations on the family theme. In order to investigate how this plasticity gets expressed in social interactions, I analyzed the expressed bout repertoires of 7 individual birds from an established social group in all possible pairs. And the first finding is that singing amount varies by partner. So although some birds do sing more overall than others, all sing more with some partners and less with others. We also see some symmetry around the diagonal, indicating a matching of singing amount in some interactions. For example, A and C here, A and G, B and E, and B and F. And still there are what look like phenotypic individual differences. So for example, D tends to elicit very few songs in his partner, although in most cases by singing not very much himself either. For our purposes, I'm going to just focus on bird A here, the chattiest bird, who tends to sing at least as much as his partner, and we're going to examine both his expressed repertoires and those of his 6 partners. What we see here is for bird A, that bird's expressed bout repertoires vary quite a bit depending on who he's singing with. So the difference is visible. These changes in the shape of the repertoire due to over and under expression of specific types of song bouts we would not obtain by chance through random resampling of the same distribution. And here are the expressed bout repertoires of each of bird A's partners. There are some suggestive similarities between the two columns. So for example, perhaps bird A sings short bouts with bird E because bird E sings short bouts. Actually, bird E sings much longer bouts with bird D, so this is raising the possibility of convergence due to mutual adaptation within a pair. We can continue building out the network, pair by pair. But if we want to understand why these production differences arise, we need to use a finer timescale. Here are snapshots of the full day expressed bout repertoires in two pairs, again featuring our focal bird A. Comparing the top and bottom left panels, we see that A's songs are more variegated with C and more regularized with D. And here you see the songs of each partner color-coded by bird, with A in red in both panels within the two pairs, and the bouts are presented chronologically from morning to evening, top to bottom. You can see that A and C alternate much more than A and D. And this is because A and C are actually taking turns, which you can see from the real-time visualization of the song bouts on the right with the silent intervals added back in. It sounds like this, one of their turn-taking episodes. This is bird C. Now bird A will join. And bird C again. A and D sing in segregated epochs, but also with much less density. So to summarize, I've complicated and expanded the zebrafinch as a model system for vocal production learning by showing that females are playing a big role in the learned communication system, even though they don't have vocal learning. That crystallized male song continues to change its bout structure beyond the so-called sensitive period. That capturing an individual's bout structure repertoire is no trivial task because expressed repertoires vary by social context, and that at least in some circumstances, males seem to be capable of adapting their songs to each other. My interdisciplinary work at PSSN has been comprised of collaborations with my mentors as well as cross-disciplinary curating, scholarship, and community building. And these are activities that I've really woven together with my research on songbirds. My collaborations with my mentors have transpired on multiple levels. So first, I've pursued opportunities to gain new skills through participating in activities outside my home discipline. In my first semester, I took a course at the Computer Music Center. I attended and presented at networks-focused workshops at Insight. And secondly, I've embarked on scholarly collaborations with George, creating a virtual bird to probe zebrafinch vocal interactivity, and with Peter, mobilizing network analyses to understand zebrafinch vocal interactivity, as well as together studying the contributions of motivation in song learning, which I haven't shown you today. And third, through my relationships with both, I've been privileged to receive what could be called kind of epistemological mentoring. So it's not a traditional training for a postdoc, but I'm referring to Peter's skilled capacity to perceive and imagine the consequences of networked relationships across scales and diverse objects, which I'm still learning a lot from, and also in particular George's conviction of the value of taking seriously musicality as a way of knowing and learning. So I think he saw something in my work that was proposing to do that and has encouraged that and helped develop it. In addition, so somewhat extracurricularly, in my first year, together with former PSSN scholar Nori Jacoby and Brian Boyd from Anthropology, I organized a 2-day conference on the transmission of songs in birds, humans, and other animals. This was a curated gathering that was open to the public, and we brought over 20 invited speakers from the humanities, the natural and social sciences, which brought together diverse perspectives in order to start a non-anthropocentric conversation on how learned vocal traditions and other communicative systems are shaped by the ways in which they are learned. This project then expanded into an interdisciplinary research topic that I have co-edited in the open access journal Conglomerate Frontiers. So the collection, which in the end had less than half of the contributions authored by participants from the original conference, is the result of over 80 referees and contributing authors hailing from traditional disciplines, including psychology, biology, linguistics, anthropology, philosophy, and music, as well as inherently interdisciplinary fields such as neuroscience, music cognition, music education, zoomusicology, sound studies, archaeoacoustics, and bioacoustics. We chose to do something pretty unconventional. Wherever possible, articles were reviewed by at least one referee from a discipline other than the authors. And our experiences as editors mediating constructive criticism across the disciplines were not without challenges, but I think they were worthwhile. We succeeded in sparking some debate about comparing cultural transmission at all across species, and this indicates a need for clearer criteria for its attribution. And our hope with the collection is that the new space it opens up will enrich discipline-based as well as interdisciplinary work on animal cultures, and also support nuanced thinking around conservation. On a personal level, my experiences organizing the conference and the special issue really put pressure on the challenges of making meaningful comparisons, and they sharpened my interest in beyond studying zebra finches as a model for something, whether it's vocal production learning or something else, to developing a fully comparative and bi-directional research program. So this is where I'm going now. I'm beginning to study communication in humans in parallel with my work on zebra finches, building on my observations of zebra finch vocal convergence and alignment, which are features reminiscent of interaction biases that have been well characterized in human language. My question is, are these biases language specific? In human communication, priming and convergence are well-documented mechanisms of alignment between two speakers. So priming refers to the reuse of a specific arbitrary linguistic form, for example, the active or passive voice. It's ubiquitous, including in interactions between strangers. So for example, if you call a restaurant and ask, "At what time does your kitchen close?" versus "What time does your kitchen close?" you are more likely to get an "at" in your response. Convergence is a more global statistical property of an extended interaction, such as a conversation, thought to rely locally on priming. These phenomena have been observed at all linguistic levels and are also described by terms such as accommodation, coordination, entrainment, and matching. They make for efficient communication, and we can sometimes see how alignment precedes or opens the way for shared sense-making. For example, in this experiment where two people were tasked with co-navigating a maze using words alone, cooperation is achieved by accepting and elaborating a joint reference frame with a common set of terms, where the important thing is internal consistency between the partners, not whether the initial individual constructions make grammatical or semantic sense. Vocal alignment is also observed between caregivers and pre-verbal infants and has been speculated to have evolved to facilitate language acquisition in children, but is alignment a feature of language, or might it reflect human social cognition at a more basic level? And is it comparable to vocal interactivity in non-linguistic animals such as zebra finches? To study this, my collaborator Olga Feher and I are designing online experiments in which human subjects are prompted to interact with a virtual partner using repertoires of unfamiliar non-linguistic signals, of course, zebra finch songs. Because priming and convergence are often coupled, we're planning to disentangle them by manipulating interaction structure in the experiment's turn length. And if alignment is observed under these artificial conditions, this would support the hypothesis that interaction biases are intrinsic to human social cognition rather than to linguistic communication, leaving open the possibility that these features of human communication are an evolutionary precursor to language and may be shared by non-human animals with sufficiently similar sociality. The stimuli are repertoires of zebra finch song that we've artificially manipulated to vary just in terms of duration and complexity. Here's an example of one repertoire of a short, simple song that has the repeating motif structure versus a song of the same duration but where the elements are scrambled. And so on. And the idea is that the subject in the experiment will be given one repertoire and the virtual partner will have another. Here's a different set of songs that is structurally identical. And right now we're first of all running an experiment to determine the extent to which these structural features of duration and complexity are perceptible to human subjects. I will be developing this comparative research program in my new lab in the fall as a tenure-track faculty member of the New Jersey Institute of Technology's Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, which feels like a really fitting next step coming from PSSN. And my official title will be Assistant Professor of Cyber Psychology. Happy to answer questions about that. I'm really happy that I'll be continuing collaborations with both Peter and George after I move to NJIT. A large part of the Songbird half of my comparative research program will involve the virtual bird that George Lewis and Damon Holtzborn and I have been developing to probe zebrafinch vocal interactivity with experimental control, work that is inspired by Voyager, George's autonomous improvising software that many musicians have played with over the years. We have developed a prototype player based on the statistics of zebrafinch singing, and once I have my new lab set up, we will begin testing it with live birds. The goal of the virtual bird is to learn about zebrafinch communication by interacting with birds in controlled conditions, in small groups as well as dyadic settings. In the future, I'm planning to create artificial cultures of live birds where the initial vocal phenotypes of all the birds are known, for example, more or less bout structure complexity, and then observe the evolution of individual express repertoires and interaction network dynamics over time. These studies will make it possible to identify individual interaction styles, and with this information to experiment with replacing nodes in the network with the virtual bird, aiming first to mimic the real interaction network and then to perturb it. So I'm thinking about my comparative communication research agenda in the context of cyber psychology as having three overlapping aims or topics, and these are building structure from interactions, learning to be social, and then thirdly, the influence of machines and technology. And in the intersection of these are the research tools that I'm developing, the interactive virtual bird, and the human online platforms, such as for the interactive birdsong experiment that I outlined. So my work observing pairs of zebrafinches and their vocal convergence lies sort of solely in the building structure from interactions area of this Venn diagram. The new project on vocal alignment in human dyads overlaps with machines and technology, as does future experiments that will look at groups of both zebrafinches and humans. And then my ultimate goal is to deploy the virtual bird in developmental experiments targeting the influence of social interactions on vocal learning. For example, by manipulating tutor song repertoire complexity, vocal responsiveness of the tutor, and/or other contingencies governing tutor vocalizations. Likewise, the virtual bird can also be used to simulate the young bird to get a better understanding of the pupil's role in tutor-pupil relationships. And since the virtual bird system is entirely acoustic, it can also be adapted to simulate multiple voices of a social group, and amplitude dynamics can be programmed to simulate approach or retreat. If interactional conditions leading to atypical communication development are identified, this experimental paradigm can also be used to test putative interventions, which could have translational value for communication and learning disorders in humans. These developmental experiments will be the main focus of my lab. And I just, in closing, like to express my sincere gratitude to the entire PSSN program, especially Pamela, Melinda, and Joseph, and also my fellow postdocs for making it such a nice community and making it possible for me to develop as an independent researcher. These conditions are very unique, and it's been extremely rich. So thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Julia. Okay, now we will go to the mentor responses. Unfortunately, Julia's faculty mentors cannot be here in person to respond. However, George Lewis, who is the Edwin H. Case Professor of American Music, will respond by Zoom. And after that, I will read a very brief statement from Peter Bearman, the Jonathan R. Cole Professor of Sociology, Director of Insight, the Interdisciplinary Center for Innovative Theories and Empirics, and President of the American Assembly at Columbia. So first, we're going to have Professor Lewis speaking from the screen.
Well, greetings to everyone from Zurich, where I'm at the moment. And hi, Julia, and thank you for that extraordinary summary of the last 3 years. It's amazing what you've managed to do, even under these awful conditions of pandemic and COVID, which I experienced both in New York and in Berlin, and you experienced right here. And a lot of things have happened. I just wanted to say just a few remarks, and maybe that would be great for everyone. When I first met Julia, I was really excited because her work explicitly foregrounded improvisation in birds, and without the usual, qualifications, masking language, and apologies that seem to stem mostly from outdated ideas that bore the influence of Western classical music's sort of century-old, but now pretty useless aesthetic hierarchy regarding the distinction between composition and improvisation. So to speak of improvisation in birds was a pretty radical step, and one that could be best accomplished by thinking through the construction of sociality, in this case through sonic gestures. And this is part of why Peter's work with Julia is so crucial to what she's been doing. What also interests me about Julia's work is that here is an example of scientific research on improvisation beyond the musical, beyond the aesthetic. Now, because the thing is, of course, we have no idea what zebra finch aesthetics are like. But Julia's exhaustive documentation, which you just saw a nice example of zebra finch bouts, provided a way for me to learn by listening what the birds had been creating. And I think I have a pretty good sense, not as much as Julia, but of how many, the repetition of songs, like when she played the first one, I said, well, yeah, I kind of know those. Now, Julia is focused on the problem of, as you saw, how birds learn how to sing, rather than the more common work on how they learn what to sing, i.e. imitation. It's sort of like the difference between giving someone a fish and teaching them to fish. And so this is where her idea of building the virtual bird came in. I mean, her first virtual birds were bird activated. The bird pecked a key to hear a tutor bird. And so we thought about the possibility of building a virtual tutor bird that could create its own songs using rules of zebra finch bouts that Julia had generalized from that vast corpus of recordings. And so, that gets into my area. That is my area of building algorithmic machine improvisers. And so Julia and Damon Hosborn, who were mentioned there, Dr. Damon Hosborn, a Columbia music DMA who knows more about my machine improvisation techniques than anybody, they actually built a prototype algorithmic virtual bird that uses an augmented transition network to create deep zebra finch bouts that can move beyond fixed song production. You saw that this is what the birds are doing. So improvisation, operates in an environment marked by indeterminacy, agency, analysis, judgment, and choice. Actually, those 5 elements, but not necessarily spontaneous production, the in-the-moment cliche. And in this context, machines can be as effective as humans, depending upon context and task specification. And if we consider the birds as operating in the same environment, learning how to sing becomes historically articulated, a kind of non-spontaneous, overarching improvisation over the lifetime of the bird. And that's articulated as a series of punctuated moments of social encounter. So, and what's interesting about that is that listening is also a practice of improvisation. I mean, something I had arguments with Andrew Goldman about all the time. And in humans, learning how to improvise also involves learning how to listen. So I just want to conclude by saying that I feel extremely lucky to have been able to work with Julia. And our work, as she said, is going to go on. Now she's got that new tenure track position in cyber psychology. We can move to build a machine learning bird that will be able to interact with the real birds, I think, by forging sonic socialities, just as my machine pianists, which you can see on the internet, can interact in concert with humans and other machines like themselves. And among other things, it occurs to me from Julia's talk, the virtual bird will have to learn how to take turns, share time, and maybe to serve as either a tutor or a pupil. And so as she notes, this is one way we can get at the mechanisms by which these birds learn how to sing, by placing them in dialogue with a kind of control bird that is nonetheless free and independent at the level of individual interactions. And I'm expecting we can gain some idea of what the birds hear and how they listen from what they do in response to the virtual bird. I'm also hoping that we can all connect with the Center for Practice and Research in Science and Music at the Royal Northern College of Music. I'm already working with them now on a machine recognizer, and I'm expecting that this work could fold right into the virtual bird work. So I am congratulating Julia on this work, which has enormous potential for discovering how we humans do what we do. Thanks, Julia, and look forward to seeing you when I get back from Switzerland.
Thank you so much, George.
Thank you so much, George. You can see the kind of excitement that we all have in this program about the research, about the collaborative research. Okay, now I am going to try to vocalize Professor Bearman. And you will find out why he couldn't be here. It's quite a story. So he says, I apologize for not being with you today. My plan was to send a video, but I made the fateful error of agreeing to crew for my brother as he took his sailboat from the Bahamas back to the States. This was to have been a simple trip, but the navigation, motor, and tiller all failed. The boat looked good when I first stepped on it, but looks can be deceiving. Keep that in mind. So I am in a small marina without internet. This message is coming to you via text message, and I suppose that is appropriate. Much of social life requires that we improvise. These two observations, first impressions are often wrong, and improvisation is the stuff of life, are the key to Julia Hyland Bruno. She, at first, appears to be an ornithologist interested in finch song, but as soon as you meet her, you realize that she is really a structural sociologist interested in and making contributions to our most fundamental problem, that is, understanding how micro behaviors and interactions accumulate into the macro structures we observe. The second key, improvisation, is really complex in humans and birds who have to improvise to become distinct identities. To do that, to create a unique identity, requires socialization, some learning for which, as an aside, Julia is interested in understanding the motivational signal, and it requires creativity. Her work, in part, looks at how finches pull this amazing trick off, and I think there are profound lessons for human society. What does all this mean? Well, for me, it's meant that I've gotten all sorts of new ideas about humans from working with Julia. And for PSSN, it means, wow, this unique program produced a neuroscientist who is driving social science. That was always the dream of the program, and working with Julia has been a dream come true. So congratulations, Julia. There you have a copy of it. Okay, we are running slightly behind here. So I think we have time for one brief question and one very brief answer.
Got it.
Any questions from the room? Any questions? No questions in the chat, but I will just ask you, what is cyber psychology?
Good question. It's a new program at NJIT, one of, I think, 5 in the world, devoted to understanding how the internet is shaping human consciousness and experience, I think. It's
very interesting.
short answer.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid we have to speed along, but before you leave that podium, I just want to say thank you so much for giving us such a wonderful exposition of your work here, and I will have more to say at the end, but thank you so much, Julia. Please help me. I am really happy to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Matthew Sachs, who investigates the neural and behavioral mechanisms involved in emotions and feelings in response to music. He received his PhD from the University of Southern California's Brain and Creativity Institute, and his projects involve applying data-driven multivariate models to capture the patterns of neural activity that accompany uniquely human experiences with music, such as feelings of chills, pleasurable sadness, and nostalgia. Please help me welcome Dr. Sachs.
Thank you, Pamela, and thank you, everyone, for being here. So the emotions that we experience in everyday life are rarely static. They fluctuate and transition, and it's this transition and this fluctuation that is part of what makes life so meaningful and rich. But normally the way it's typically been studied in neuroscience is more statically with images or faces or very, very short clips, which has some methodological benefits, but doesn't necessarily capture the rich experience of our everyday lives. The emotions we experience actually fluctuate and transition in a pattern that is predictable, and our ability to predict what emotion one person might experience from one moment to the next relates to our ability to understand that person and connect with them. There's also implications for mental health and well-being, which I'll talk about in a second. But music, it's a temporal art form that, when you think about it, naturally does this, right? The music that we love and listen to most frequently, rarely is it one particular note or one particular emotion. It fluctuates and transitions, just like Bohemian Rhapsody probably does, if you're familiar with that. And it's this ability to mix emotions and transition between emotions that makes music one of the most ubiquitous and liked art forms around the world. So the goal of my research is to take dynamic stimuli like music and movies and determine how the brain maps from this dynamic emotional stimuli into the possible experiences that we can have and the temporal trajectory of those experiences. So I'm going to start by talking about two studies that I've been working on here at Columbia for the past 3 years. One looking at temporal dynamics in the brain through film, and one with a completely new model of music stimuli that we created. For the past 3 years, I've been working, when I originally started, with 3 mentors, and then I shoved a 4th mentor right in the middle there as I started here, who each bring a different perspective to this question of music, emotions, and dynamics. So Mariusz Kozak, who's a professor in the music department. A lot of our discussions have been around what makes music able to produce an emotion both in our minds and in our bodies, and what actions and what social processes are involved in the experience of an emotion in response to music. With Professor Chris Peacocke in philosophy, most of our discussions have been around the sort of typical basic emotions that you might think of when you think about emotion theory, but how can we expand those to include more action modalities or emotions related to expressive actions, and how can we capture those in the way that we ask people questions and the way that we design our music. With Chris Baldassano, a lot of the focus has been on designing the methods that go into modeling the brain dynamics with these event segmentation models that he's pioneered. And finally, with Professor Kevin Ochsner, our work has mostly been about discussing the theory behind emotion dynamics, what makes an affective experience dynamic, how does emotions bleed one into the other, and how can we measure that in a way that matches existing theory. So the first study is kind of a proof of concept to describe for the main focus of my postdoctoral work, which has been on the music study. So this first one is with an existing film set where thousands of kids they have data on thousands of kids watching this 10-minute clip from Despicable Me, and we took a subsample of this of 15 to 20-year-old children who were watching this Despicable Me clip in fMRI. And with Chris and Kevin, we've developed this method of mapping from the emotions that a person is experiencing and the changes in those emotions onto brain state changes. This involves this event segmentation model, which I'm not going to go into too much detail, but imagine you have this approach where you can computationally determine when does this model think that the brain is in a stable state and when does it think it's transitioning into a new state. And you can sort of plot the probabilities there of when it thinks it's transitioning. And then we can get some behavioral ratings of how people are actually feeling while they're watching this movie and find out where in the brain is there a match between these emotion transitions and these brain state transitions. And with this particular movie, we found that regions of the brain that we know are involved in emotional experiences and we know they're involved in sort of narrative processing also seem to be reflecting these brain state changes that map onto the emotional experiences in response to the movie. Interestingly, this also seems to vary with individual differences. So one great feature of this data set is it has a lot of information about the mental health of the participants. And what we've shown is that behavior, at least, when participants are watching this film, they report less positive emotions in self-reports, and not the brain yet, when they have higher symptoms of depression. And this appears to also map onto the brain. So the actual event patterns, the patterns in the brain that map onto the different emotional events of the movie are less typical. They look less similar across people in the individuals who have higher depressive symptoms. So this is true in the temporoparietal junction, this area of the brain that we think of to be really involved in understanding the emotional states of others, amongst other things, as well as the parahippocampal cortex. So using these, this is going to be one project and one publication, but I'm using some of these results to inform the hypotheses from the main focus of my research, which has been on this music-evoked emotion dynamics study. So one issue with the film study that's described is we had to kind of retroactively determine when we think emotion transitions were occurring or what emotions they were, because the stimulus was not designed for that, and it doesn't necessarily happen with a certain frequency or pattern. So the first question was, how can we get a better sense of the ground truth, of knowing when things are happening and what they might likely are? And rather than hiring a film crew to make me a whole new movie, I hired 3 composers where we collaboratively wrote a completely novel piece of music, a long, continuous piece of music, where we have a sense of when these things are happening. So with Hunter, Ryan, and Sanjay, who are all, or were students at the, some of them have graduated at this point, but they were students at NYU's screen scoring program, thank you. We designed this musical stimuli specifically for the purposes of fMRI. So I asked them, I said, take these 5 emotional states, and I want you to write a musical theme that evokes one of these 5 emotional states, and to create 6 to 7 examples of each one. And here's the kicker. I wanted them to be at least 30 seconds in length. Keep using the same 4 instruments across all examples, so you only have 4 instruments to use, and the tempo can't change beyond that of the ratio of the TR of the scanner. So the scanner makes a noise at a certain frequency, and I wanted to match that frequency, so the beeping noise of the scanner, by keeping the tempo consistent. This also allowed us to get rid of sort of maybe possible acoustic differences between these different emotional states. And finally, we also set the key of the piece itself to match the fundamental frequency that the scanner evokes. It was also designed to make this as sort of rich of an experience inside of a scanner, which is not a rich or fun experience at all. And so what we did is then we had them take these different emotional events that they composed and stitch them together naturally. So they were able to write transitions between them, and they flow in this way that it feels like one continuous piece of music, but we have a sense of when transitions are occurring and what state is supposed to be evoked. And the great thing about making it this way is we can create multiple versions of these where we can systematically manipulate the ordering to test certain hypotheses. So I'm going to give you an example of one particular kind of transition between 2 states. So hopefully you heard a nice sort of natural transition between some more joyful or upbeat music to something more sad. And so this is great. We had this music ready for us, and the first question that we wanted to make sure was that, all right, so the composers wrote this, but does this actually evoke feelings in people who weren't the composers? And for this, there was no kind of existing tool for doing this online, and so we had to develop one. So with one of my former collaborators, we built this online tool for collecting emotion ratings live continuously while people were listening to the music. And the way we did this was we gave people some choices of possible emotions they might be experiencing, and then we told them to press a button whenever they felt that emotion coming on within them, and then to press the button again, or an all-off button when they no longer felt that emotion. And what that allowed was us to capture multivariate data, so multiple emotions could be on at once, in a relatively low cost or low effect, low stress way. People could just sort of press buttons on or off. And I'll show you some results of that. Once we had these behavioral tests, we started moving into the fMRI. And for that, we did a little bit more editing of the music. So with the Computer Music Center and Sound Art program, we had a professor, Seth, come in and actually mix the music itself for the scanner. So he was able to be inside the scanner, listen to the music, and adjust the different bandwidths and filters to make it sound even better inside the scanner. So this is him shouting to his tech from the scanner. He said, turn up the gain. It was pretty amazing. He could actually just purely hear the frequencies and that needed to be adjusted without any sort of reference point. So then we've now collected fMRI data, and we're done collecting fMRI data with the help of my 3 research assistants. We've collected data from 47 participants. And the structure of the task was essentially to just lie in the scanner and listen to the music and try to enjoy it as much as possible. So everybody listened to piece A and piece B in a random order, but only one of the versions. So there was a version 1 and 2 of each one, and they only listened to one of those 2 versions. And then there's a movie in the middle that people also watched as sort of like a refresher and to help us with some of the modeling techniques. And then outside of the scanner, so they didn't write anything inside the scanner, we played them little excerpts or moments from the pieces of music they just heard and had them rate how different emotion aspects of how they remember feeling when they first heard this piece inside the scanner. So how much did they enjoy it, how vividly did they remember it, and then how intense was their different emotional responses. And what I'm going to play you right now is just one participant's brain while they were listening to the music. Nothing scientifically interesting here. This is just plotting essentially the signal that we get from the fMRI scanner, with red being above the mean signal for this person and blue being below the mean signal at every 1.5 seconds. So what I hope you saw there, though maybe not, because there's nothing going on here other than just bold numbers over time, is that there was kind of a stable pattern when the music was in one particular theme, and then in that moment where the transition was happening, where the emotional transition happened, there was sort of a rapid fluctuation, and then it became sort of stable again. So that's exactly what we're going to look for in our models. We're looking for where we see stable patterns that are then rapidly transitioning into a new stable pattern. And what we find is that regions, mostly in the auditory cortex, but as well as some other regions in the frontal gyrus, are sensitive to those emotion transitions. So what I'm showing you here is the same thing that I was showing with the film data set. Where do you see that the brain state transition patterns map onto the emotion transitions that the composers wrote for us? And what's really interesting about this is that the auditory cortex, which we really think of as kind of typically like a low-level processing of just sounds, is really reflecting some temporal dynamics experienced of, and the emotional experience of the participants here. And let's get into the emotions, because that's part of what this is. And right now, this is just collapsing across all possible emotions. But from those, the behavioral data set where participants listened to these and reported their emotions, you can actually see how these things are fluctuating over time and how they're really a mix of different things. So what I'm plotting here is the number of participants that had any of those 5 buttons on, and the buttons are color-coded accordingly, during that full piece of music, and the gray bars here are when the composers wrote transitions between different states, and then you can see that they're labeled according to how the composers intended them to be. And I hope you see that there's this nice crisscross pattern, mostly within these transition points where the sort of dominantly held emotion switches. And so what we're doing right now is figuring out how these transitions, the exact nature of the transitions between different states are reflected in that brain pattern that I was just showing. The second question that we can ask with this data set is, how does the context, so how does what came before emotionally, or just in general what the music came before, influence the current representation of an emotion or current representation of music? Because as I mentioned, we're able to create these sort of different versions of each piece, where right here what I'm showing you is two different pieces, the exact same pieces of music, but the order is different. So in piece A, version 1, that sad piece there that's then going down there, that's the exact same music. Tonally, everything is identical. The only thing is different is the placement of where it is. So in version 1, you can see it's preceded by an anxious clip, and in version 2, it's preceded by a calm clip. And we've shown behaviorally that this influences the degree of ratings and the degree of timing of these ratings. What came before it influences our perception of where we currently are. And it looks like this is also represented in the brain as well. So the auditory cortex seems to change its representation of that emotion, of that music. So this is just basically comparing the similarity in brain states between people that heard this music in one context versus another. So exact same music across all people, but the people that heard it in the same context show stronger correlations than the people who heard it in different contexts. The idea being that the auditory cortex is actually aware of what came before it in some way. And so figuring out exactly what that means is sort of this next step of this project. Speaking of next steps, I put this slide up 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago, when I originally applied, of my timeline for this project, which was slightly delayed, but for the most part, most of the things that I had originally put up have been completed. So I did apply for external funding. We created a musical stimulus. We got emotion ratings. I didn't do that. I'm probably not going to do that. I did do that. I collected data from 40 to 50 people. And we are kind of right here, if you can think about it. So I'm planning, despite what happens next year, which I'll talk about in a second, to continue this project to the sort of last stage here. The other next steps that we want to do, and we've kind of proposed, is try to bring this experiment a little bit more out into the real world. So people are listening to music inside of a brain scanner, which is a very unnatural experience. And so I started off by saying our emotions in everyday life are these rich experiences that transition with certain frequency, but we're not collecting anything about everyday life here just yet. And so one way I think this research could go is to really see how the time-varying patterns of the brain that we see in this 1-hour scanning period are reflected in the emotion dynamics we experience in everyday life. And we can use something like experience sampling, so actually probing people's phones and asking them how their emotions are changing, and then relating that to the brain patterns and see if there's a connection between how stable our brain patterns are or how rapidly they're transitioning and how stable our emotion patterns are in everyday life. And finally, there's like a very clear translational potential to this because we know from previous evidence that from experience sampling that fluctuations or sort of rigidity in our emotional states relates to mental illness. So the last step would be to kind of relate these three things to see if the brain patterns in everyday life mediate this relationship between everyday emotions and negative mental health. In addition to these two projects, the postdoc has allowed me to collaborate with professors and researchers outside of Columbia as well. So I'm going to briefly talk about two of the projects that I've also been working on with professors outside of Columbia. One with my former advisor, who's a professor at Northeastern, Psyche Louie, and one with a former grad student, or a former postdoc here who's now a professor at UCLA, Dave Cluett. And so this first one comes from we really wanted to test these two existing theories of the rewarding aspects of music. One being that music evolved and music is so rewarding because of its unique social ability, its unique ability to connect us with other people. And so far what we've shown is that there's actually a strong relationship between the degree to which people find social rewards are sensitive to social rewards, so how much do they find reward in being with other people, and how much do they find that music is rewarding. So there's this strong relationship that we're finding here. And then the other hypothesis is that, these can both exist for sure, is that music is rewarding because it so naturally sets up predictions and then can violate those predictions or confirm those predictions in a way that and it's this process of learning predictions that is actually what we find so rewarding about music. So I'm going to talk really quickly about a study that we're doing to look at this. We know that this ability to understand what's going to come next and then be confirmed in that or not is what results in things like the experience of chills, so these intense experiences. But what we don't know is how this process really emerges, because most of the studies that have done this have used very traditional Western music that we're all very familiar with, so it's sort of hard to disentangle where this learning came from. And so to overcome that, we've designed a study that takes music and puts them in this very, very unfamiliar key called the Boland-Pierce scale, which is not natural to any instrument, but you can tune certain instruments to play in that way. So almost everyone is unfamiliar with it. And then we expose people to these melodies a certain period of time. So we have one sort of way that you're learning the structure of music just by pure exposure. And we also create versions of this that are modified so they don't end in the same sort of structure. So we have a kind of a global learning here and a more local learning here. And then we have this process of them listening over and over and then providing liking ratings for each of these clips, both pre and post learning. And what we're showing is that the more people are exposed to this melody, this original melody, the number of times that they're exposed to this original melody, liking ratings goes up. So you're able to learn this structure, and as you're learning it, you're able to like these things more. And this is also true in these modified versions. So these modified versions weren't repeated a certain number of times. You only heard them at the end, but you still like the modified version of the piece that you heard 16 times more than the modified version of the piece that you didn't hear at all, but not as much as the original. So there's two different ways that we're learning structure, both this global and local structure. And very interestingly, this also varies with individual differences. So if you look at a behavioral scale of how sensitive people are to musical rewards, so how much they really like music, the people that do not, who something called music anhedonia, are not learning this, are not able to change their liking ratings number of repetitions. And finally, I'll talk very, very quickly about a study that I've been working with Professor Dave Cluett at UCLA. He has this very interesting work that shows that events and event segmentation and different sort of events in our lives break up our memory for things. So if you ask people, or influence our memory for certain items. So if you ask people how far apart were these two items in time that span some sort of event boundary versus are within a boundary, and importantly, they're exactly the same length in time that a person saw them. The only difference is that there's some sort of event that makes them in one versus the other. An event can be lots of different things. He's done it with like beeps, for example, creating sort of a one beep and then another beep that changes the context. You remember things that are within events as more closely together than things that span event boundaries. And what we're doing is using the exact same music that I developed to create a kind of more musical, naturalistic event-y space here, where instead of beeps or instead of images or something like that, we're using the music that the composers developed, and we're finding the exact same effects so far in preliminary things, that things seem closer together when they're within an emotional musical event than across a music event, even though they're actually the same distance apart. Okay, so I also originally put up this slide when I first applied for the PSSM program about why Columbia and why the PSSM program in particular. And I mentioned how it has this building, which we're currently in, how it has the Computer Music Center, and how New York is this rich and vibrant place for music and culture. And I think actually a lot of these, despite my typical pessimism, actually are true and seem to be a part of what I just hopefully showed to you. So I scanned everyone here. We're currently in this office, and I've had the resources from here to be able to complete this project. I also worked with people at the Computer Music Center, like Seth Cluett, to design the music for the scanner. And the fact that I was in New York, I was able to connect with the 3 composers and other professors at NYU who were able to write this beautiful music for me. So I think a lot of this actually could not have been possible if it was not for this program and Columbia itself. I also was able to form collaborations and some other non-research-based projects that sort of came out of this that I think could only exist here. I also was able to work on a research topic for Frontiers that was multidisciplinary, and I developed a couple different symposium for the PSSM program and also a symposium for the Neurosciences and Music Conference. I want to talk particularly about this book chapter that I wrote for this book that's called Science, Music, Borderlands. So it's truly a dialogue between like half of the chapters are written by humanists and half of them are written by scientists. And I co-wrote a chapter with Jamal Williams, who is somewhere here. I don't know where he is. Third row. There he is, yes. Oh, he's next to me, yeah. All right, so we wrote this chapter together, and one part of this experience was to actually have a workshop where everyone came together and read each other's chapters. So a person in humanities read a person in sciences chapter and vice versa, and received feedback, and it was incredibly frustrating and unbelievably hard to navigate, surprisingly, and I do think I've honestly learned a lot. Vijay Iyer was someone who read our chapter, and then I subsequently invited him to give a talk here, so I think there was a lot of collaborations that merged, and I don't think it would have been possible for me to honestly handle that if not for the experiences that I've had here at Columbia. So, and the PSSM program in particular. And finally, so I'm moving on here, and I considered a lot of different options beyond Columbia. I applied for some tenure track positions at music and neuroscience focused centers. I also applied for some different companies that have behavioral scientists and music focus, and ultimately have decided to go work for the meditation app Calm, who has a whole science team that are former academics, where their goal is to study the effectiveness of music and meditation on health and well-being. So their research priorities currently are to evaluate the impact of Calm on health outcomes, as I just said, as well as mechanisms of action by which this mobile-based delivery service of both music and meditation influence people in the real world. They're very dedicated to publications and have a rich history of publishing empirically driven results, and already have an R01 to study some of these things. They've currently made this really big bet on music by collaborating with artists to specifically get music designed for health and well-being. And my job here would be to develop and evaluate a mobile-based music listening intervention to improve mental health in patient populations, which would involve designing studies, running studies, analyzing data, and speaking with the different stakeholders involved here. So that's where I will be going next year. And with that, I want to thank Pamela, Melinda, Joseph, Darwin, and everyone else who's been involved in the PSSN program, the research assistants, the 3 composers who are here, and everyone else at Columbia and my mentors who I've been working with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. I have 2 responses before we bring your mentors up to the table. You can start coming up here, dear mentors, and sit here in front. First of all, I'm so glad PSSN was able to overcome your characteristic pessimism. Another achievement we can check off. And also, I really think that cyber psychology, you may find Julia's department studying Calm and other kinds of social media or app type development. Very interesting. I'll really look forward to hearing all that you find out. Okay, so now I would like to very briefly introduce Matt's mentors in order to give their responses. First of all, Christopher Baldassano, who is Assistant Professor of Psychology. Kevin Ochsner, I'm moving from the left here. Kevin Ochsner, Professor and Chair of Psychology. Mariusz Kozak, Associate Professor of Music. And at the end, Christopher Peacocke, Johnsonian Professor of Philosophy.
Great, thank you. So yeah, as Matt mentioned at the beginning of his talk, this topic that he's looking at of emotion dynamics is something that's very commonly experienced in real life. That musician Phoebe Bridgers has a song about how emotional motion sickness, how you're sort of getting pulled between different emotions during your life. And the reason, despite this being such a central part of our experience, the reason it's not studied is because it's very, very difficult. The kinds of things that Matt was working on, you're taking this continuous musical stimulus, which is really incompatible with the way that we usually study things in psychology. On top of that, he's trying to map it onto emotional states, which are one of the most challenging things to operationalize and think about in psychology. On top of that, he's trying to connect it to mental health outcomes, which brings its own set of challenges. And so, really, the sort of long story short is that Matt really pulled it off to create these connections. And that was made possible through this PSSN program, and also Matt being a really unique kind of person that's able to bridge these fields, that has this kind of deep understanding and appreciation for the musical aspects of these, that this is not just a stimulus, this is an art form that we need to understand. he has the psychology background to be able to understand how to craft these scientific questions. He has the technical skills to be able to run all of these analyses, which, again, are really sort of at the forefront of thinking about how we can make these quantified kinds of claims about these types of stimulus responses in psychology and neuroscience. And so it's been a privilege to work on this. I mean, the mode that Matt and I worked on for most of this is that I would sort of propose a vague idea of something we might be able to do. Matt would go off for a week, and I'd get like a few Slack messages, and then he'd come back the next week with like a fully working prototype of this analysis. And that's really like the dream as a research PI, that to have that kind of relationship where my vague ideas can work. I can work on them with Matt, and then he can operationalize them into these really totally new kinds of analyses to answer these scientific questions. And so it's been great to see that success, and it's been great to see this both the projects being completed and also Matt having a great next place to go to continue this work being done. I should say too, just being in the PSSN program, so I started working with Matt pretty soon after I joined Columbia, and so it was really the program has been such a great way for me to meet this interesting cross-section of faculty throughout the university, and through the working on the projects and through the PSSN events has been had a big impact on my scholarship and on my network within the university. And so I'm really glad this gave me a chance to be involved.
Great. So Matt, it's really been a great pleasure to have your unique combination of very integrative interests, diverse talents, understated resilience, and button-down intensity in my life and in the lab. I do think that's something of your Obama-esque uniform, where you must have like a rack of button-down shirts, because I don't think I've ever seen you wearing anything else. It looks great on you. Keep it up. New York City is a place that rewards people who are very goal-directed and unafraid to embrace the complexity, ambiguity, and inevitability of human experience. And in every meeting I've had with you, you definitely do that. I'm often struck by some of the most interesting research in psychology focuses on topics that are an incredibly important and fundamental aspect of our everyday experience, but the fact that they're so much a part of our everyday experience, we take them for granted, and so we don't study them. Music is certainly one such aspect for experimental psychology, which has left it almost completely untouched until the last few years, or I shouldn't say completely untouched, but it hasn't been studied as much as it should be, given how fundamental and everyday it is. And certainly the dynamic unfolding of emotional experience is another such everyday aspect of human life that hasn't been studied nearly enough. I remember our initial phone conversations before you'd applied to the PSSN program, where you sketched out almost everything you talked about today, including the research framework. I remember talking about that, and then I saw the slide, and I thought, my God, did he have that slide made already in that phone conversation? One of the most exciting aspects of working with you has been this bridging of not just different phenomena, but different aspects of psychology. So research on perception, memory, and emotion, just to name three. You've taken approaches that were initially developed to study the segmentation of the continuous flow of our everyday experience, our perceptual inputs, and to turn them into discrete episodic experiences. And you're now applying that to the study of emotion. And that's got me to think about emotions. It's almost like the wave versus particle theory of light, where it's like emotions can be discrete episodes that are static things, but they're also continuously dynamic and unfolding. And I think you've developed this really interesting set of stimuli and methods that allow us to unpack both at the same time. And I don't know anybody else who's done that. I think that's really very, just frankly, cool. It invites us to ask new questions, right? New methods and new approaches always invite us to ask new questions. Now we can think about, in a very concrete way, when, how, and why we experience complex blends of emotions, both within an episode and because of the transition from one episode of emotion to another. And we have methods and tools to unpack that. So that's very cool. And again, I just want to highlight how much you're focusing on aspects of everyday experience that much of affect science has just sort of pointed at and said, yeah, that would be really cool to study. Nah, it's too hard. But for you, you're just kind of like, no, I'm just going to do that. That's that understated kind of resilient aspect that you bring to everything. And finally, along those lines, I might note that, at least in my experience, a hallmark of someone who's going to be really successful, no matter what career path they choose, is how people respond to setbacks and how they move forward when they've gotten feedback. The pandemic, I can't think of a bigger setback that any of us have faced as a collective humanity. And you've always been weirdly resilient and positive in the conversations we would have on Zoom.
With us, yeah. To you, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, fair enough.
Alone by myself, less so.
Fair enough. And I've been really impressed at how meticulous you are, how detail-oriented and focused you are in the work, in the theory, and in the integration of all the different elements. And I really appreciate how clear and engaging you are in the way you present the work. You know, people often sort of feel like, you know, it's like the old, if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, you know, did it actually happen? And then they worry, like, if research is done and no one understands it, did it actually happen? But I think you have a way of presenting the work in a way that engages a diverse audience and helps them see how all these different elements are connected. So I just want to say thanks for the experience, and I wish you all the best as you continue to be very calm in the face of whatever happens next.
All right. Music is one of the most complex forms of human behavior. In fact, few music scientists, and I suspect fewer musicologists still, would attempt to define what music is, let alone embark on a search of the roots of its quite obvious emotional impact on listeners. So when Matt's application, in which he endeavored to study precisely this matter, landed in my inbox some 4 years ago, it was with excitement but also anxiety that I rendered my positive review. Excitement because I had wanted to mentor a PSN postdoc since the program's inception, and this project seems to be very much aligned with my own interests. But anxiety because this was clearly a study that had a tremendous upside predicated on even more tremendous risk. It's easy in music neuroscience to iron out the very stuff that makes music meaningful, its emotional richness and cultural value, in service of pretty graphs and even prettier brain scans. Usually, the concerns of a musicologist like myself are misaligned with the concerns of neuroscientists like Matt. PSSN, and this is something almost enshrined in its principles, is designed to stage a clash between these differing concerns, throwing the scientists and the humanists into the same pool without life jackets to see what floats to the top. I can happily say that in Matt's case, no such clash took place. Rather, what emerged in these 3 years was a series of incredibly collegial, productive discussions that have ultimately led to a rich project that, as Matt's future job attests, has implications beyond the narrow scope of academia. I attribute this collegiality and productivity to two things. One is that both Matt and I grew up playing music, myself on violin and Matt on piano and bassoon. This already guaranteed that we shared a language that facilitated mutual understanding. We could discuss aspects of behavior and neuroscience on the one hand, but also musical structure and its possible effects on listeners on the other. The second is that Matt was at every turn open to dialogue. Having a foot in music science as well as in musicology, I can tell you that despite the rhetoric of interdisciplinarity, this is a surprisingly rare quality. We spent hours going back and forth on the design of the musical stimuli. Me arguing for maximum complexity and real-world correspondence, Matt keeping these ambitions in check and reminding me that these are meant for an empirical study, not a concert. Although, I should say congratulations to the composers because they really did create music that could be very, very well put on a concert. Another example is that me constantly poking at the definition of music in this study versus Matt's utmost certainty that we know it when we hear it. So I couldn't be more pleased with the effects of these discussions, and I'm excited about these initial results that Matt presented today. In particular, it's amazing to me to see how the timing of listeners' emotional responses is dependent on musical context, and how the brain responds differently to the same acoustical signal depending on the emotional state of the listener. So often in these kinds of situations, or in these studies, the sonic context is taken for granted, but its stability is obviously put to question by the fMRI data. And so what excites me the most is that Matt's 3 years with us ended up with even more unsolved questions than when he started, and I couldn't have hoped for a better outcome. we were asked to sort of reflect on our roles as mentors, and I should say that another incredibly rewarding part of having mentored Matt was the connections I made with the other faculty at Columbia, connections that would have been far more difficult or even impossible to make without PSSN. I'm grateful that I got to know the other mentors as well as the other faculty involved in the program. As a dutiful humanist who, like a medieval monk, sits all day in his windowless office, I really don't have windows in my office, it was nice to get out every once in a while and celebrate the different milestones in Matt's and the other presidential scholars' terms with us. So Matt, congratulations on this really fascinating work that you managed to do with, in what's been a remarkably difficult time, and best of luck to you in the future. Thank you.
Okay, so also give my congratulations. This is exactly the kind of research we hope to see done in PSSN. Really genuinely cross-disciplinary. As I think Kevin said, when you get really original research, it often raises at least as many interesting questions as it answers. And what I'm going to do here is just comment very briefly in my allotted 3 minutes on 4 different areas in which Matt's work raises interesting hypotheses, issues. I've got them categorized here as the empirical, the conceptual, the aesthetic, and issues relating to other domains. So very briefly, on the empirical, looking at Matt's data and research, one immediate next step is to ask, well, which particular brain regions are particularly important for particular kinds of emotions? And if you look at earlier work, especially work of Joseph Parvizi in Stanford, he's shown there's very, very close connections between the anterior cingulate cortex and the very striking thing that you can hear in music, which is sometimes overcoming with determination all kinds of apparent obstacles. If you stimulate this region, he gets results like, oh, it's as if I'm driving in very difficult circumstances and the rain is coming in, but I will overcome somehow. Certainly you can hear certain passages in Beethoven like that. So the question arises, can we use the same techniques to get much more fine-grained account of which regions are important in which emotions? On the conceptual front, as Matt indicated in passing, there's categorizations within the families of emotions. Besides the traditional joyful, sad, nostalgic group, there are ones that are the action modalities that he mentioned. You can hear weakness, you can hear determination, you can hear various kinds of action modalities in music sometimes. There's also a third category, what we might call the epistemic emotions. You can hear awe in music, AWE, awe in music, but you can hear confidence, you can hear uncertainty. If you listen to Janicek, you can sometimes hear uncertainty in the music. On aesthetics, these points, which I think Mariusz also touched on, the point that what you hear in the music and the point at which you begin to hear it depends on prior context, is incredibly important in aesthetics. I can think of immediately applications of that. So I'm sure a lot of you know Beethoven's C-sharp minor string quartet, opus 131, actually the last movement he ever wrote, a very, very serious last movement, almost all in the minor, and then there's 3 major C-sharp major keys at the end. These C-sharp major keys, which by themselves just sounded would be joyful and positive, do not sound that way. You can be absolutely certain that Beethoven knew how they would sound. And it's very natural explanation is what would otherwise be the onset of the positive emotion is set back by the earlier context. So I think there's going to be all sorts of interesting applications in aesthetics when you develop these points further. Fourth area, much more speculative, very interesting, the phenomena of musically anhedonic subjects, extremely interesting. And the Boland-Pierce scale, I'm sorry you didn't play it. I love it. It's just terrific. I think you said it's alien music sometimes, but, yeah. But it's very striking that the anhedonic subjects don't pick up structure, don't come to enjoy it. The question then arises, are there parallel phenomena in other art forms? So many people have commented that some of the structures you perceive in music are similar to certain kinds of structure you perceive in poetry. The prosodic structure, for example, can be heard metaphorically in various ways. The question arises, is a certain kind of anhedonia in music, is it modular, is it restricted to the musical, or do those subjects have, for example, certain kinds of difficulties in picking out stanza structure in poetry? These are cross-domain issues, and clearly empirical issues, but we wouldn't have been able to formulate them properly without these kinds of insights. So these are, an enormous number of interesting issues here. I wouldn't have thought of any of them if I hadn't come in contact with Matt's work. So terrific, congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you. We do have some questions. We don't have much time, so what I'm going to do is read them out, and because I think they're indicative of just how stimulating your ideas have been in terms of impelling people to ask these questions. But I want to start with one that's actually addressed to both Julia and to you, which is, and it's more a comment, several years ago I witnessed at a small music concert in Prospect Park in Brooklyn a bird that started to respond to the music. We didn't see this bird, we only heard it. Okay, so a couple of questions from the chat. A question about cultural background when it comes to subjects' response to music that is familiar or predictable. So that's a kind of obvious question for your research. And then could the findings of this study open doors to searching better ways to detect mental health issues early on, contributing to designing more accurate diagnostic tools? If you want to say just a couple of words to either or both of those, please.
Sure. I'll comment on the first part, which is the cultural background, which is a hugely important feature of this. In the study that I mostly focused on with the composers that wrote it, it was mostly, all the data was collected on Americans, and there's obviously a cultural variation there that we are not designed to study, but that is going to play an important part. Interestingly, to this particular question, when I showed that was the whole sort of point of using those Bowl and Pierce melodies, is that people don't have that familiarity in any culture, and we actually replicated those exact findings that I showed in a Chinese population. So people living in China are able to learn in the exact same way. So the idea being that familiarity definitely differs by culture, but our ability to learn how to make predictions doesn't seem to vary by culture. And then this second question of could this findings open doors for better ways of detecting mental health issues, I hope that would be a lofty goal, that it can at least develop new ways of looking at mental health issues and diagnosing. A lot of the ways that's currently being done with the brain is, again, kind of using either very static images or not even any images at all, just looking at the brain at rest and trying to look at how the dynamic patterns might predict rates of depression or features of depression. But if we have a stimulus that's really driving people through different emotional states, maybe that's a better way or a different way of predicting certain features of mental illness, and maybe to cues us into certain brain regions that we might specifically want to target to impact the emotional deficits associated with certain mental illnesses.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you, Matt, and thank you to all the mentors, and please help me thank all of these wonderful researchers who have contributed to all of this. So thank you very much. So I just want to close today's event by saying that the PSSN program has been in existence since 2015. And during that time, as its chair and director of the Center for Science and Society, I've learned so much and been so stimulated by all of our brilliant scholars. At the end of every year, I'm surprised that they're already leaving us and reminded how much I'll miss the departing cohort and all of their fascinating research and particular insights. But I'm also, I have to say, immensely proud of what they have accomplished in this year very difficult times, and the fact that they're going out into the world where they will change the disciplinary silos of their universities and the way research is conceptualized and carried out in their various and multiple areas of expertise. And I'll just mention that our postdoctoral scholars have been very successful in getting positions that allow them to continue their interdisciplinary work. And it's really a credit to their creativity and deep thinking and the work of all the mentors while they're here with us in the PSSN program. And it's no different with this year's cohort, who have been absolutely stellar, and I will miss you so much. I want to say that I've also learned from and been immensely grateful to all the mentors who have worked so hard with the scholars, as well as to the many, many faculty and researchers at Columbia who invest really a lot of time in reviewing our applicants and working with our scholars. I especially want to acknowledge and thank the present members of the PSSN Steering Committee, Christopher Peacocke, Carol Mason, Valerie Purdy-Greenaway, Peter Bearman, and Rui Costo, and our pinch-hitting member this year, Aniruddha Das. It's due to your dedication to interdisciplinary undertakings, to your rigor and your open-mindedness and creativity that we get these really amazing scholars. I also want to acknowledge the Zuckerman Institute that has been a wonderful collaborator with us, and especially Rui Costa and Daphna Shoami. And finally, last but definitely not least, I am deeply grateful to the PSSN staff, Joseph Sulik and Melinda Miller. They don't just support the whole infrastructure, because no part of the program would function without them, but they also hold an invaluable reservoir of institutional knowledge about this complex place we inhabit, and are instrumental in achieving and constructing the intellectual and community building aspirations of the program. I also want to thank staff members of the Center for Science and Society, Carolyn Sermon and Darwin Eng, and I really appreciate if you would help me thank these wonderful staff members who it's really my privilege to work with. I invite all of you to join me downstairs for drinks, food, conversation on the first floor in this building at Oliva, where we can continue the conversation and celebrate the end of the year and the, sad but happy. A good mixture of emotions are involved in seeing our postdoctoral scholars this year leave. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for tuning in to all of you on Zoom. Thanks so much.